Hi, everyone, and thanks a lot for joining us. I'm DeMarco Morgan. Americans paid respect Monday to the nation's 41st president, George H.W. Bush, who passed away over the weekend. His body will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol until Wednesday morning. CBS News chief congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes has more.
In a moment made for the history books, the sun set over Washington as the casket bearing the 41st president of the United States was carried up the Capitol steps. Awaiting it at the top, more than a dozen members of President Bush's cabinet, along with his vice president, Dan Quayle, and an emotional 43rd president, George W. Bush. Inside the Capitol Rotunda, the Speaker of the House paid tribute to a remarkable life.
There was that image of him as a loving father reaching out to hold his son's hand at the National Cathedral after 9/11.
Here at the Capitol and across the nation, flags fly at half-staff. The New York Stock Exchange observed a moment of silence for the 94-year-old who passed away Friday night at home in Houston after telling his oldest son by phone that he loved him. This morning, the younger President Bush greeted his father's casket at Ellington Air Force Base in Houston. The extended Bush family accompanied the casket to Washington aboard Air Force One, which was renamed Special Air Mission 41 for the flight to Joint Base Andrews. Mr. Bush's service dog, Sully, who kept watch at his master's casket overnight, made the journey too. At Andrews, another solemn tribute from the military for a man who was not just commander-in-chief, but one of the youngest naval aviators in World War II, flying 58 missions in the Pacific, starting at age 18. He never lost that love of flying. An aide revealed this weekend that Mr. Bush, who also loved to make a statement with his socks, had chosen to be laid to rest wearing this pair. After the war, George Herbert Walker Bush went to Yale University, founded an oil company, served 2 terms in the House of Representatives, and fathered 6 children with his beloved Barbara Bush, who passed away in April. In the 70s, Mr. Bush was appointed ambassador to the United Nations and director of the CIA.
This is the course we're going to go.
He lost his bid for the White House in 1980, but the man who beat him in the primary tapped him as his running mate, which led to an 8-year partnership. Vice President Mike Pence.
I'm told as he was preparing to become vice president, he once joked about the job, saying that there was, quote, nothing substantive to do at all.
So help me God.
In 1988, Mr. Bush won the race to succeed President Reagan by a landslide, steering the ship of state as the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the first Gulf War broke out, only to be defeated in 1992 by a Democratic governor from Arkansas who tapped into the nation's growing economic anxiety. President Clinton told 60 Minutes that the two developed a bond anyway.
It's been one of the great joys of my life, my friendship with him. Our arguments were good-natured and open, and we continue to debate things all the way up until recently.
This afternoon, members of the public began lining up outside the Capitol to bid farewell to the man who famously called for a kinder, gentler nation.
And Nancy Cordes joins me now from Washington. Nancy, good to see you on what has been an emotional day. If you could, please describe the atmosphere there on Capitol Hill.
Well, it was really striking, DeMarco. You know, I was standing right in this spot just a few months ago when John McCain was brought here back to Capitol Hill from Arizona, and he lay in repose in the U.S. Capitol. And that was certainly a very moving ceremony filled with lots of emotion and lots of respect. But to see a former president brought here in a hearse and his casket removed by that military honor guard as the Army band played Hail to the Chief, to see his former cabinet standing there at the top of the steps as the casket was carried up those steps, step by step, was really an incredibly moving scene and a reminder of the kind of respect that we afford to our former commanders-in-chief. It was really a very rare sight. And then inside the Capitol Rotunda, Mitch McConnell, who is the Senate leader and one of the only members of the Senate at this point who was there when George Herbert Walker Bush was president, talking about their relationship, talking about his legacy, and really sort of hearkening back to a different time here on Capitol Hill and here in Washington. Sure, there were plenty of fights back then, plenty of arguments, plenty of stalemates, but also it was a time when compromise was respected and something to strive for. And that's the tone that you heard today from a number of the speakers, the fact that he really was someone who was looking for ways to work with the other side. And even though it angered his own party from time to time, he did manage to achieve that, and that is going to be part of his legacy.
And I guess, Nancy, with our current political climate, was it surprising or refreshing to you to see that there was some sort of unity on both sides of the aisle today?
It's very refreshing, and there is a genuine love for this man from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who look back and say that he managed to accomplish quite a bit in his 4 years here in Washington as president, and then, of course, played a very significant role as vice president for 8 years before that, and really has this unbelievable resume and held so many positions of importance here in Washington. He was the chair of the Republican National Committee, and a lot of people forget that he himself was a member of Congress for 4 years and made an unsuccessful bid for the Senate before he decided to run for the White House. And it's going to be very interesting to see over the next couple of days how many people file through the Capitol Rotunda, members of the public, to pay their respects. Back in 2006 and 2007, over the new year, when Gerald Ford was lying in state here at the U.S. Capitol, 57,000 people filed, DeMarco, through the Capitol Rotunda to pay their respects. 100,000 people filed through the Capitol Rotunda to pay their respects for President Reagan. And so that kind of gives you a sense of what we're going to be seeing over the next couple of days here before the casket is taken to the National Cathedral on Wednesday morning for a memorial service there.
And I guess a final thought for you. What do you think his legacy will be? Have we seen it?
I think that we have. And I think, first of all, it was sort of the dynasty that he built, the Bush family, the fact that he was such a strong and respected patriarch that his son would end up following him into the White House. Beyond that, the relationships that he was able to build with the other side. When he was president, it was very important to him that he have strong bonds with members of Congress. He would invite them over to the White House. He would call them on the phone. He would send them notes. And that is something that, has waned a bit in the years since. President Obama famously said once, when asked why he wasn't hanging out more with Mitch McConnell, well, why don't you go have a beer with Mitch McConnell? Sort of signaling that this was not something that he necessarily thought would be a great use of his time because things had become so gridlocked. Well, George Herbert Walker Bush tried to avoid that by developing these personal relationships. Sometimes it succeeded and led to breakthroughs. Sometimes it didn't. But he clearly saw value in the relationships themselves, not just the transactional nature of them, but the value in those relationships, in sending messages, long and short, to the people who make decisions about what happens here in the U.S. government. And so it's sort of nostalgic to talk about it now. It feels a little bit quaint, but it probably carries a lot of lessons that our politicians today can learn from.
Yeah, a lot of respect for Mr. Bush, and he most certainly will be missed. Nancy Cordes in Washington. Nancy, good to see you. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Marco.
Well, meanwhile, President George H.W. Bush will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol through Wednesday morning. A funeral will then be held later that day at the National Cathedral in Washington. And on Thursday, there will be a private funeral in Texas, after which Mr. Bush will be buried. He will be laid to rest next to his wife, former First Lady Barbara Bush, and daughter Robin at the Bush Presidential Library at Texas A&M University.